Right, hi guys. So this is for the NUSPA semifinals. This house regrets the prevalence of localized forms of English, for example, Singlish, Spanglish, Manglish, basically Singlish. I don't speak any of the others. Right. So as with most motions, we need to start with an understanding of setup, right? And the first word that will obviously like jump out is the idea of prevalence. There are some motions that say this house regrets a trend. And this trend becomes very relevant, right? Because what it means is that it's not just that this thing exists, but that more and more people are using it. In this case, what does prevalence mean? My take is, so I think like reasonably means a lot of people use it. I think that makes sense. Obviously not everybody uses it, I guess. And I think a very good way in which you can approach these motions is just to grasp the reality. So like, as long as the edge core didn't screw up, and in fairness, this can happen, the motion that you're regretting must be something that actually happened, right? I could not say like this house regrets the ubiquitous perfect English in Singapore, because that I would be regretting something that didn't happen, which is impossible in a retrospective motion, i.e., yeah, I can't regret something that doesn't exist. And so the same logic exists here, right? So the way I would approach the word prevalence is just to think about Singapore. Most people speak Singlish, depending on your social circles, I guess. But overwhelmingly, people speak Singlish. We've tried to eradicate it and it's failed. That I think is a reasonable understanding of the word prevalence. So my point is always be alive to these words in a motion. Even though in this case, I'm quite willing to say it is basically status quo. The second thing to note is, if not this, then what? And this is really important, as you'll get to later, but just think about it, right? If we didn't have a lot of people speaking Singlish, what are our options? So presumably the idealized option is that you have people speaking unadulterated English and unadulterated local language. Right. Most logically, if I cannot have a half past six English, then I'll have perfect English and perfect other language. Or could it be that people will speak only one or the other? Or could it be that in line with doing one of the or the other, you will largely teach English? So the example I put there of Indonesia is, to my understanding, and I may well be wrong, what happened in Indonesia historically, where Bahasa Indonesia instead of Dutch was used as the administrative language, having which I believe a lot of local elites spoke Dutch as well. But the point is that presumably maybe you have one language only, which is English, and everybody else, like, either the local language dies or everybody just struggles to reach a good level of independent English. Or maybe you would like not have the European language as the lingua franca. You have a local language or a new language like Bahasa Indonesia as a lingua franca. And so the question I've asked there is such a world actually possible? And the reason this is relevant is debating does involve some degree of suspension of reality. And this has been my problem every time I think about this motion. Like, if we didn't teach English, surely it is actually practically impossible to have an unadulterated English, because like very naturally, if you can't find the word, you replace it with a word you know and you figure the other fellow might know. And then you end up with Singlish, right? So I don't know. But functionally the debate needs to sort of exist with one of these comparisons as a possibility. So basically, to cut a long story short, you need to decide which of these seem like a more likely alternative and roll with it. That's my take on this motion. Right. So with that setup in mind, we get into the arguments, right? And I think this is fairly straightforward in that I think most of you have been exposed to a significant degree of the speak good English movement and all that. So you should be fairly fine, right? So what are some problems with Singlish? The central one that you have all been taught, I think, is that you speak Singlish, you cannot speak good English, right? Either one, you don't learn it properly in the first place, or two, you can't code switch. So like, functionally, when you're out there in the world, you end up speaking Singlish to people. And in fairness, I mean, yeah, kind of happens to me. But I think the important thing to note here is how to turn something that you know in broadly in society, and your teachers tell you into an actual argument. And this is really, really important, because what differentiates your, like, I guess, the majority of school speakers, the school speakers who can win a significant amount of their debates, is the ability to turn ideas into arguments. Because honestly, right, like, at least from what I've seen in Singapore, very rarely do people get it completely wrong consistently. Most of the time, people often get it correct. Sometimes you get it wrong, and that's normal. But the difference is you can turn it into argumentation. And the central questions you always ask are like, why, how, so what, right? So in this case, I've got Singlish, and I've got the claim that it stops me learning English or code switching. The central question I have to ask is, how do I link these two? How does speaking Singlish commonly stop my ability to learn English or stop my ability to code switch? And here, I think, like, you want to come down to, I actually think about the struggles that you have, right? And I think about this a lot because I have apparently a fairly strong Singapore accent. I also speak a lot of English. So just think in your life when this has been a problem. And if you don't have this problem because either you've been a really successful code switcher or you didn't really have Singlish from start, then tough, I guess. But then the answer is try to imagine and try to empathize with, if you had to learn another language, for example, but a language that was sort of similar yet different. And so off the top of my head, some issues that might exist that I personally have are like grammatical rules are different. Terms, there are a lot of terms that I've reached a point where I no longer know whether they're Singlish or not. And that might be a problem in English, right? So that's just two examples, and I'm sure you can think of more about why knowing Singlish hurts your ability to speak English. And I actually think the critical thing is that they're so similar, right? Like, so for me, my other language is Chinese, is Mandarin. And Mandarin is obviously drastically different from English. So obviously, sentence structure is still a bit of an issue, but you do switch your frame of mind. And that's a bit harder in English, right? Because it's adjacent to Singlish. So that's explaining how it would impede your ability to do this. And these illustrations are important. These illustrations being both at the point of learning the language as a child and using these languages as an adult. The next question is, so what? Right? And here it's again a bit of illustrations and examples. I think this is a bit of an illustration heavy motion, but here you need to actually explain what the implications are, right? So again, I'm probably fortunate approaching this motion in that I have some degree of personal experience of bit like bit paiseh, a bit embarrassed, having like at some point I was talking to like my like Western, I guess, Canadian friend in debate, and I literally had to go, I'm sorry, I don't know if this one is English. So yeah, like there is that awkwardness that even in your social relationships. And apart from that, I'm sure these are things you've been told as well, right? You don't get respect in the international community because you seem to be speaking a so-called pidgin language. That has implications for the first impressions people have of Singapore, of you and the international job market, etc. All of these are some classic stuff that you'll have about why it's important to speak good English. I think that aside, there's another question that I've been pondering quite a bit, which is whether this is really, Singlish is really that egalitarian. I'm not enough of a linguist to know if this is true or not. I just suspect that as a Chinese, my ability to access a version of Singlish that most people speak is a lot greater than if I didn't speak Chinese, or for example, if I wasn't like, I don't speak dialect, but sort of know the dialect languages vaguely. So I think there's a question about whether it is genuinely true that if you have this non-English language, that these local people really can access it as much. I think it's fair to argue then that the comparative of a genuinely neutral language of English might be valuable. So yeah, these are two issues I've had with Singlish. I think you all can come up with more. But the central thing to note, however, is what does all of this compare against, right? And this is important, and we'll get back to this. But yeah, just think about it. Like, right, like if I'm saying something is not egalitarian, is the alternative more or less egalitarian? If I'm saying that you end up not being able to learn English, on the other hand, would I be able to better learn English? That must be the question in your mind when you're developing these arguments. Right. So what are some nice things about Singlish? Yeah, and I think here, there is the idea of it being a shared language, and I think this is quite valuable. I think you can suggest there's an informality about it. There is the ease to which people can pick it up, because it's, I guess, a bit close to mother tongues that we already speak. See, here I've been careful because there's an argument that people tend to use that you need to be a bit careful with using, which is, it's easy to pick up Singlish because you speak it from young. Like, that's how most of us picked up Singlish, right? But the problem is, if that's what you're arguing, and the gov says, well, in our world, we would speak perfect English from young, then you're stuck with the argument, and the argument would go back to explaining why you wouldn't, well, getting a bit ahead of myself, but then that if they can prove that the alternative is that they speak perfect English from young, that would take out your argument that you speak Singlish from young and therefore you're just more familiar with Singlish. But from there, I think there's stuff about how this shared language is useful to bridge divides, especially among people who might not learn English, etc. Yeah. The second thing that I think you could argue is that you still have the capacity to interact on some level with the working world and colonial masters. And this is all valuable insofar as you can, like, if you think about what Singlish does, right? Like, in reality, I think we look at a lot of creoles of English. A lot of it starts out with trying to pitch at English at a level that is accessible to the locals and accessible to the rest of the world or the colonial masters. Or in Singapore, I mean, Singlish becomes sort of a middle ground from people who speak only English, right? They're able to, I don't want to say bring it down because I hate the idea that Singlish is inferior to English. But they're able to code switch into Singlish that becomes a middle ground. And here the questions then become like, at what level of understanding do we have? So is it that the majority of blue collar workers, right, would be able to understand this level of English and allow them to partake in the workforce? Is it that if we couldn't, and so that's like the, how do we get this interaction, right? And then the question next is obviously, so what if you can't get this interaction? Is it that workplace gets a lot harder? Is it that if you don't speak English, they are a lot less likely to get hired at all, as opposed to shipping in international like workers, etc. I think the important thing to know about this point is that as it stands at the moment, and I'll explain why it can change later, as it stands at the moment, it's very mitigatory against the claim that you need to, that your English learning ability is impeded, right? Because that made an argument about economic harm, like, well, there's some other possible economic harm. But I think realistically, you are not, like, because the outcome of the argument that everybody is going to like not get employed is very unlikely. It's really unlikely, right? Because it will be exorbitant. It will cost a lot to ship people in who speak English to do low level work. Chances are that these middle management will just end up speaking the local language. So I'm a bit unconvinced by this argument myself. I do think that it works best at this point as a bit of a mitigation in terms of the outcome of the argument. I think what you can then do is unpack the shared language thing, right? So just now I said something about how you've got that relationship going with people. I think there's another discussion to be had about a shared culture that arises from that shared language. Like the way, people out of Singapore kind of bastardize the idea of la because it's supposedly very unique to us. But the point that goes behind that is feeling like there's something unique about that area, right? In a world where colonialism is basically wiping out and delegitimizing a lot of your other local cultures. So I think there is room to be developed of this shared language point. But again, all of this beg the question of what is the alternative? Because you construct these as good things about the status quo, but if Gov had a better status quo, then the question is, so what about all of these arguments? And so that's where we get to the counterfactual, which is where all of these like assorted ideas really come into like being important. So the first question that you want to ask is whether English will be lingua franca, or will be the most popular language, the most commonly used language. My suspicion is that in all of these places, the answer is probably some version of yes, because very few colonial masters come in and concede the ability to control the language that they speak as the language of business. It will be so much more difficult for them. And probably like might have a worse world if you didn't speak some iteration of English, considering English eventually becomes the international lingua franca anyway. And I think that was always going to happen. So yeah, that's probably how that debate might play out. So I'm not convinced it's that strategic for Gov to be like, look, I think the alternative to English is everybody would just speak, I don't know, Malay or Chinese. So yeah, but I do think that is a discussion to be had about what the alternative is. Yeah. Second, I think there's a question about whether people can actually learn unadulterated English and whether they can code switch. And this is really important, right? And this is to me, the centerpiece of is not good things about Singlish. It is, can people learn this English? And the reason for that is if they can't learn this English, then a lot of Gov's benefits are going to fall off the debate, right? If you pitch the level of the working language as something that they cannot access. And here I've written incentives and capacity, and this is how I approach a lot of questions like this. So incentives is like, do people want to learn English? And take it from different angles, right? Do locals want to learn English? Do the colonial masters want them to learn English? I think these are important questions that build whether people are going to try to learn and have the ability to learn. And that speaks into the second question, right? The capacity. Do you have the capacity as a local population to learn English? Does the colonial masters have the capacity to teach English? So incentives and capacity are linked, but if you see them as two different ways of approaching this characterization battle, then that helps you make this argument. And I really think that this is the issue in the debate, right? Like, to the degree that Gov can prove more people can learn, they're more likely to win. If Op can prove very few people can learn, Gov is not likely to win. But then that goes into the second way of winning this debate, which is if we accept that people are not homogeneous, right? And this is important. People are never homogeneous in the debate. And if that's so, then we hit a trade-off. Because I think reasonably, Gov will end up in a situation where they increase the number of middle-class people who can code switch. Right? Who can speak two languages, or are effectively bilingual and it's not mixed up, rojak kind of thing. But probably they would, in some ways, lock out more lower and middle class or low SES people from something, right? Lock out the economy, lock out of the culture. In fact, I think it's fair to argue, and I apologize for that first bullet point, that possibly Gov might end up in a position where they say, yes, more middle class people speak English and be really bad at their local languages. Kind of like what Singapore increasingly has, even with Singlish, but I digress, right? So probably most people speak great English and subpar mother tongue, so to speak. And probably more lower middle class people would speak their local languages, and not really be able to access the economy or the shared culture or shared elite culture. And at that point, if that's the trade-off, right, then you need to work your way through some of these questions, like which group is more vulnerable? Can one group being successful help the other group? Which issue is more inherently problematic? And the important thing is, when you work through the trade-off, so the first thing we've done is to scaffold where the trade-off comes. Who wins, who loses? What does each side win and each side lose? And from there, then the next question we need to do when we scaffolded this trade-off or sketch out this trade-off is to be able to find the metrics by which we are making comparisons. So in this case, we have got 3 metrics. And then you need to answer the question of why do I win one metric or the other? And then in a higher level debate, you need to answer why is one metric more important than another metric. So for example, here I might argue that the lower middle class people are more vulnerable, right? Because they have less options, they have less savings, their existence is a bit more risky. So I would rather a world that protected them. And then the other side, probably on Op. Gov might well argue, it's great that when middle class people can speak good English, because the more keyed into you are to the economy, the more investment that you get, because these languages tend to exist in LDCs, right? Recently developing. And consequently, what that means is that that's how we get investment. Whereas the comparative, if we had less investment, is that life is worse for all of us. And so this is kind of a direct challenge to the idea of vulnerability in the first trade-off metric, so to speak. And then the final question of which issue is more inherently problematic, by which I mean, can we change either of these? And this is honestly one that I don't know where it'll go. Like, it goes back sort of to the question of, can we learn English? And so depending on how that issue got litigated, this question of inherency might be used to shift the extent to which each group exists, or how big each group is, and consequently how badly they are unable to speak like better English. So yeah, these are all the ways. These are not all the ways, definitely not all the ways, but these are some ways in which this trade-off might happen in the round. So the last thing I'm going to say for this motion is that there is a pretty excellent, in my opinion, documentary by CNA Insider. So if you just YouTube CNA Insider Singlish, it's a 2-part series, and the first part is a really interesting bit that I've always thought problematizes this motion. This is not to shit on the edge core, because like it's a very common motion, but I've always thought it's problematic because it assumes that Singlish grew off English, and one of the profs in this documentary kind of takes a different stance on that. So I think that that's quite interesting, worth your time if you've got time. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. Any questions, I will try to reply in comments.